everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany. I feel like most areas can pretty firmly say that they're in spring. I think for a lot of areas, March is this tempestuous month where you just kind of don't know. Are we gonna have more winter? Are we gonna have more spring? Sometimes it's a little of both. But, you know, coming into April now, pretty soon here, is, I feel like, really firmly in like spring territory for even the colder areas. So as the sunshine is starting to come out more and green things are starting to sprout, I just find myself like wanting to read books that reflect that, books that reflect growth and new life and transformation, and even better if it's like atmospherically spring, so descriptions of nature and things as well. So today I have for you 12 books that are reflective of springtime. The first book that I'm going to mention here is actually one of my favorite books from 2020, and that's Emily of New Moon by L.M. Montgomery. So most people know of Ellen Montgomery for her Anne of Green Gables series, and that is wonderful, so definitely not knocking that series. But I had never heard of Emily of New Moon. I picked these up at a thrift store sometime last year, the whole trilogy, and I think I paid like 50 cents a book or something. So it was so totally worth it to me. See, there's even still a sticker on there. Anyways, so it's so totally worth it to me when I hadn't even read them to go ahead and pick them up for that price. And I'm so glad I did. These books are beautiful. So there are some parallels to the Anne story. In fact, when we begin Emily's story, her father is very sick and she finds out that he's dying. And towards the very beginning of the book, within the first chapter or two, her father passes away. And so she goes to live with her two aunts, spinster aunts, and her uncle on a farm called New Moon. So Emily is in some ways similar to Anne in that she really loves books and nature, but she's really different from Anne too. And this book is wonderful for springtime. Emily absolutely loves spring and talks about the beauty of spring. And one of my favorite quotes from the book is Emily saying, "Spring is such a happifying time, isn't it?" And I just love it. It's such a wonderful story. Next up is a children's book, but it is not one that should be discounted by adults, and that's The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. And this book is lovely. Like, its depictions of nature are just wonderful, and there are really good stories of friendship in here, and there's really funny moments too, so it kind of has it all. This is a really good read aloud for kids. I think that it is gorgeous and perfectly set up for spring. In fact, in the very first chapter, Mole wakens from his hibernation and feels a desire to clean his house and get out into the beautiful spring weather, and so it's perfect. If you get to the original illustrations, it's illustrated by Ernest Shepard, who also illustrated the Winnie the Pooh books, and I love his illustrations. I think that they're so just charming and adorable. I gotta read this quote for you about spring though. So it's talking about Mole cleaning his hole in the ground, and then it says, "Spring was moving in the air above and in the earth below and around him, penetrating even his dark and lowly little house with its spirit of divine discontent and longing. It was small wonder then that he suddenly flung down his brush on the floor, said 'bother' and 'oh blow,' and also 'hang spring cleaning,' and bolted out of the house without even waiting to put his coat on." And there's him coming out of his hole into the beauty of springtime. This is a very wonderful book to read during spring. Another wonderful children's classic for spring is Heidi. Heidi is such a beautiful story in general. Again, about an orphan girl. There's a lot of children's books that are about orphans. But anyway, so Heidi is an orphan and she goes to live with her grandfather up on the Swiss Alps. And there's so much beauty in this story, talking about just the gorgeous scenery on the Alps and the goats that are playing up there and the plants that grow. And Heidi is just such a beautiful child. She's so sweet and kind. And the transformation of the grandfather in this story is absolutely beautiful. Like, when I was reading part of it to my daughter, I actually teared up a little because it's just It's such a wonderful story. Highly recommend, definitely not just for children. It's a great one for adults. And now I'm going to mention my all-time favorite children's book of all time. Like the book as a child that I returned to and read over and over again and have such beautiful fond memories of and still just love like eternally is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. And if you can get your hand on this copy illustrated by Tasha Tudor, the illustrations are gorgeous and just add that much more to the story. I am reading this right now out loud to my 8-year-old, and it is such a joy. It is the best time of the year to read this. We're almost done with it actually, and we started when it was a little bit more wintry, and this is perfect for winter season going into spring. It tells the story of Mary Lennox, who is an orphan. Her parents have died in a cholera outbreak in India, and she's forced to go live at an uncle's house on the moors in England, and everything's so different for her. And she is this selfish, spoiled little child. So not only do we get the transformation of the gardens from wintertime into springtime, but the transformation of Mary from this selfish, spoiled, horrible little child to someone that actually is a good friend and a joy to read about. So we have absolutely loved this story. Okay, now we're going to move into some grown-up books. So the first one that I'm going to recommend is one that I just recently read and was in my mid-month wrap-up, and that's The Language of Flowers by Vanessa Diffenbaugh. So this is the story of Victoria, who is 18 years old, and she has aged out of the foster system and is currently living on the streets. But she absolutely loves flowers and has greatly studied and learned the meaning of flowers, because back in Victorian times, when a suitor would send you a bouquet, each different flower has a different meaning. So you would decode the message that was sent to you through this bouquet. And so she kind of uses her gift and her knowledge of the different meanings of flowers to help people around her and get a job and different things like that. And it's a beautiful transformation story of love, and it's really sad too, because it really shows you how rejection like impacted every single relationship that Victoria has in this book, how it's so hard for her to trust and to love and to let go. And so it's definitely a really sad and intense story, but it ends on a very hopeful note, and it's really beautiful. And I feel like the flowers in this story and the transformation element make this a perfect springtime read. So a book that I do not own but I absolutely adore is A Girl of the Limberlost by Jean Stratton Porter. So this book is the story of Elnora. She is a girl who has grown up in kind of like this marshy swampland area. I guess it's marshlands in Indiana. And so she's grown up there, and her mother's never permitted her to go to school, and she's finally convinced her to go to school, but she's in high school and her clothes are strange and outdated, and so it's making it hard for her to fit in. But it's a really wonderful transformation of her relationship with her mother and her finding love and her just cherishing and treasuring nature, and it is just really beautifully written. It's one of those books that's going to make you want to be outside and go hiking and see all these beautiful things. And it's really kind of funny because I lived in Indiana for a really long time. So you know, when you think of Indiana, you think like flat land and you think cornfields, and that's not really inaccurate because there is a lot of that. But there is beauty and there is nature, and it's just such a beautiful reminder to me that like there's beauty all around us. And sometimes you think like, oh, it would just be beautiful if I could live here or I could do this. And I don't know, this book just kind of made me want to explore where I live and be happy with where I am. So, but it is a really just a beautiful story, and Elnora is just, I love Elnora. Like, she is a wonderful protagonist and I love following her. The next book that I want to talk about is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. It's a story of this girl, Francie Nolan, and the story begins when I believe she's 10 or 12. She's somewhere in that age range. And it's basically the story of her growing up, and it's a story of hardship. I'm not gonna lie, it's very depressing in a lot of scenes, but there's such a message of hope at the end of overcoming difficulties and obstacles and things that life throws in your way, that you don't have to be stuck there, that there's a way out of these things, and that even in the most harsh climates and even in the places where it seems impossible, there's still ability for growth and even an ability to flourish and move past those circumstances. So it's really, really beautiful. It's really sad in a lot of places, but the ending just wowed me. Just really gorgeous. Really love this book. The next book is one of my favorites by one of my favorite authors, and that's Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I feel like a lot of Jane Austen's books are really wonderful for springtime, but Pride and Prejudice was the first one I thought of. First of all, if you're not really familiar with Jane Austen, it's a great place to start. It's very accessible, very witty, very funny. Definitely like tops for like some of my favorite, one of my favorites of hers. But it's a great transformation story of people who think the worst of each other and learning to look past that, look past your pride and look past the prejudice that you have towards other people. So wonder where she came up with the title for that. But anyways, like it's really wonderful and it's beautifully written and I feel like it's very springtime atmospheric. It talks about all the walks that they take, and it's so interesting because it's so different from nowadays. Like I feel like a lot of people don't take like daily walks in the country, and so I feel like it's one of those books that definitely like makes you want to be outside more, which seems very springy to me. And also I love this edition. I think it's so pretty. This is the Paper Mill Press edition. And I'll leave a link for that below. I always link all my books in the description. I don't know if I've mentioned that before, but in the description I always link all of the books that I mentioned, so that way you're able to easily find them. And if it's a book like this one that is a specific like really pretty edition, I try to link that edition if you're interested in that particular one. The next book I'm going to mention is one of my top books from 2020. I actually have a blog post that I wrote on that before I started BookTube, so I will link that blog post in the description, so that way if you want to check out what all of my top books were for 2020, you can. But it's The Yearling by Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. This book doesn't, I mean, some of this book does take place in spring and some of it doesn't, but it's definitely this coming of age transformation story. It's about a boy named Jody who is growing up in Florida. And I really didn't know much about this book when I started reading it. I just knew it had beautiful depictions of nature, and indeed it does. Like, probably, it's pretty unparalleled. It's probably one of the top most beautiful books that I've written in those regards. But I will warn you, there's quite a bit of heartache in this book. So if you don't like books that make you emotional or make you want to cry, you might not enjoy this one. But it is a story of Jody growing up and realizing kind of the harshness of the world around him. So he loses the innocence of boyhood and becomes a man and realizes kind of all the loss and grief that that entails. But there's a lot of beauty in the story as well. Next is another book that I just recently finished, and that's A Room with a View by E.M. Forster. So this book is about a girl named Lucy who is growing up and realizing kind of the restrictions and expectations of the Edwardian period, and realizing that she's not sure that she wants to live her life that way. She's struggling between finding the balance between propriety and then like what her heart really desires. So this is a romance, and the first half of the book is set in Florence, Italy in the springtime, which makes it perfect. And the second half is then set in England. I had a hard time getting into this book at first, so if you start reading this and you're struggling a little bit, give it time, because the second part of the book, the last like 100 pages, is way better than the first 100 pages. So, but the longer I have let this book kind of percolate, the higher of a star rating I want to give it. I really enjoyed it. I loved Lucy's story, but in addition, there are some really beautiful quotes about love and life and truth that I wrote down because I don't want to forget, because they were really impactful to me. And also, the banter and dialogue in this book is hilarious. So it's kind of like, it does have some wisdom there, but I would definitely say this is a much lighter read. The next book I'm going to mention is Far from the Madden Crowd by Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy is known for being a heartbreaker. He writes really depressing books, but Far from the Madden Crowd is a very good entry point into Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy has just exquisite descriptions of the English countryside, which is why I included it in this list, because I just feel like it's gorgeous and it makes you feel like you're really there, and it's just so beautiful. I love it. I actually watched the film with Carey Mulligan in it before I read the book, and I loved the film, and the book was even better. So isn't that always the case though? That's definitely how I always feel. So this is the story of Bathsheba Everdeen, and she inherits this farm from somebody and is trying to run it, and she's not married, and so everyone kind of looks down on her because she's a woman and they feel like she can't do it. She doesn't have the head for the finances and she's not strong enough to do this, and you know, basically she proves them wrong. She's a very strong, very intricate, very interesting female character, but then there are 3 different men who are all like in love with her and want to marry her, so there's that romance dynamic to it as well. It's a really interesting book. Like, it's definitely one that kept me very engaged, and if you like Thomas Hardy's other books, you'll really like this one. If you didn't like some of Thomas Hardy's books, you might really like this one because it doesn't have the same depressing qualities to it, and while there is definitely commentary on women's roles in Victorian time periods, I didn't feel like it was as strong of a message as Tessa the D'Urbervilles, and I also didn't feel like it had that kind of anti-marriage, anti-religion kind of exploration that Jude the Obscure had. So if you struggled with either of those books, you might actually really like this one. I saved my very favorite book for last. All Creatures Great and Small by James Herriot. This book, I mean, some of the books that I've mentioned are like these amazing transformation stories or have great depictions of nature, but they have kind of some hard things or some sad things. All Creatures Great and Small is not that. All Creatures Great and Small is wholesome and lovely and a breath of fresh air. This was probably the only book in my top 10 books of 2020 that was not sad, because I tend to like books that make me feel things. But this book did make me feel things, but it made me feel all the warm fuzzies. So this is the story of James Herriot, who is a country vet in England in the 1940s. I mean, 1930s to 1940s. I can't remember exactly where it is. There are other books in the series. This is the first one. I've read the first 2 and they're both wonderful. I'm getting ready to read book 3 pretty soon. But it tells about his experiences helping with the animals, and then also, you know, his experience dealing with the people in the countryside. And so it's just kind of, you know, it's wonderful. If you love animals, you will love this book, and I feel like it's great for the springtime because although he does talk about the harshness of winter and his job and doing those things in those seasons, like a lot of the books takes place during lambing season where he's, you know, helping sheep to deliver lambs, and that's during the springtime. So I feel like it's a perfect fit for spring, and I just love his descriptions of the English countryside. It makes me want to be there. It's so beautiful, and just the stories are so wonderful. It's like a hug in a book for me. Like, I just really loved it. Well, that's it, I guess. Those are my 12 books that I recommend for reading in the springtime. I am one of those people where I always just kind of used to read just like whatever I was in the mood for, but I'm finding within the past year or two that I really love reading seasonal books that kind of get me, I'm already kind of in a seasonal frame of mind, and so reading certain books in certain seasons just adds to the atmosphere of the season, and I've really enjoyed that. So hopefully these springtime books are helpful to you in that. I would love to know if you have any specific books that you like reading in the spring or you feel like are very well suited to spring. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, please hit like and also subscribe, and I will see you again next time.